When we think of Homer's Troy, we imagine it in fantasy hues of times long gone. And yet the latest research conducted at one of the world's leading mathematicians proves it to us irrefutably. What we know as the Trojan War was in fact the First Crusade. We are talking about obvious parallels between two major military campaigns separated by millennia. The Trojan War and the First Crusade are but different names of one and the same military campaign. The former ended up in the distant past due to the blatantly erroneous chronology that we use. One that was created by the Jesuits in the 16th-17th century. This chronology, regarded by many as the absolute historical truth, contains many gaps and repetitions. Most major historical events as well as personalities and even places have several phantom duplicates arbitrarily dated to various antediluvian epochs and presumed completely unrelated to one another. The Trojan War and the First Crusade are a perfect example. Our entire view of the so-called Antiquity and the Middle Ages changes radically. History becomes streamlined and unencumbered by all the Dark Ages, lost empires and mystical cyclic patterns that afflict the official version. Classical Greek poleis become one with the medieval Crusader states. Ancient Egyptian paganism identifies as Coptic Christianity, and historical Troy, Constantinople and Jerusalem turn out to be the same city on the Bosporus, which we know as Istanbul. Jesus Christ was born in 1053 AD and crucified in 1086 AD. Crusaders did not wait for 1,000 years to punish the tormentors of Jesus. There isn't a single Crusader map in existence that would locate Jerusalem in Palestine, or indeed give us any detailed information about that region. Unlike modern historians, medieval cartographers knew the location of the Holy Land perfectly well. Sounds absurd? Not if you have read history, fiction or science. By Professor Anatoly Fomenko, a brilliant mathematician and a true scientist to the core. Unconfined by dogmatic thinking and determined to get to the bare historical truth at any cost. We are accustomed quite well to thinking that the events described in the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, date back to an epoch so distant that it can hardly be called historical in the usual sense. We seem to know everything there is to know about these times and these characters, in particular that most of them date to epochs preceding the new era by a couple of millennia, and that the events described in the Bible took place in and around the Middle East for the most part. Could all of what we know be untrue? Even the most scrupulous of scientists who ever had to tackle the gigantic array of data contained in the Bible were basing their research on the existing chronology. The sole exception to this is a group of mathematicians who have used the newest statistical methods to analyze the Bible from an altogether different standpoint, having revised the consensual chronology completely prior to that. The results are astonishing to say the least. We learn that the biblical Jerusalem was in fact located on the Bosporus and known as Constantinople, and that the biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judah can be identified as the medieval Roman Empire. The familiar characters transform into the medieval doppelgangers, which are a lot less familiar to us but known quite well to historians.
This book will change your entire perception of history forever. What if ancient Rome, Greece and Egypt were invented during the Renaissance? What if the Old Testament was a rendition of events in the Middle Ages? What if Jesus Christ was born in 1053 and crucified in 1086 AD? Sounds unbelievable? Not after you've read History, Fiction or Science by Anatoly Fomenko, the leading mathematician of our time.